Herzlich willkommen zum Transatlantic Tuesday diese Woche. Mein Name ist René Freudenthal vom Carl-Schurz-Haus vom Deutsch-Amerikanischen Institut und wir sprechen heute mit Katie Stallard über ihr Buch Dancing on Bones, History and Power in China, Russia and North Korea. The cover is right next to me. Katie Stallard, I'm going to say a few words about her and about the book for people who don't know about it yet. She serves as senior editor at the new Statesman magazine, where she writes wonderfully about China and global affairs, is a regular contributor to World Review, their really remarkable foreign affairs podcast. Previously, she was based in Russia and China as a foreign correspondent for Sky News. We're going to hear a lot about that as well. She's reported from more than 20 countries to date, covering conflicts, natural disasters, and some of the world's most repressive regimes. A little short note for everybody, please turn off your audio, so mute yourself so our sound is perfect for everybody else to listen in. Katie Stallard is also the author of Dancing on Bones, as I've mentioned, as well as a non-resident global fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. She has written for The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, The Wall Street Journal, and The Diplomat before. So about the book, in just a few words, we're going to talk about it, of course. History didn't end, democracy didn't triumph. America's leading role in the world, that way around, is no longer assured. Instead, autocrats and populist strongmen are on the rise, and the global order established after 1945 is under attack. This is the phenomenon Katie Stallard tackles in Dancing on Bones. She examines how the leaders of China, Russia, and North Korea manipulate the past to serve the present and themselves, of course, and secure the future of their rule. So it couldn't be more timely as well. Russia has annexed Crimea. It started a land war in Ukraine last year, as everybody present knows. China has stepped up war games near Taiwan and militarized the South China Sea, while North Korea has resumed missile testing regularly and makes blood-curdling threats against the United States. All of these are nuclear powers, as you will be aware, and we will talk about all of them and what they're doing with history to shape their present. And with that, welcome, Katie Stallard.
Thank you very much for having me.
So much is made since February 24th, 2022, the start of the current land war, about the naivete of our end of history era. I'm a child of the 90s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union. And back then, we lived in a kind of post-history society, at least it felt like that to some people. We were advancing into the 21st century, throwing off this dead weight of the past. But now it can feel like sometimes as if you're like wholesale returning to the former century. It's a very creepy feeling. And your book describes how autocrats in China, Russia, and North Korea have maneuvered to give World War II in two cases and the Korean War in one case a kind of immovable presence, maybe permanence in national life. And I was wondering, in your view, after having spent so much time on this subject, on these subjects, when does history really stop being history in a way and becomes a kind of myth?
Well, thank you for the wonderful question. I think in all three of these countries, the issue is that history is really very present as a political tool. And I want to be clear at the outset that this is by no means only autocrats who do this. I grew up in the United Kingdom, where the Second World War is a cultural touchstone for everything from sports to weather to the Brexit referendum. leaders in democratic systems are perfectly capable of telling a very selective version of the past to suit their own needs. But in all three of these countries, I felt that the past, and in particular, the history of these past wars, in North Korea's case, particularly the Korean War, as well as the end of the Second World War, and in the case of Russia and China, what we would talk about as World War II, what they would talk about respectively as the Great Patriotic War and the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression, had really returned front and center to their contemporary politics. And I think if we start by just looking at Russia, we can see very clearly how Putin is drawing on the history of that past war to frame his current invasion of Ukraine. I heard somebody talk about it earlier today as a new patriotic war. You know, the way that he justifies his current aggression is to look at the past, to look at the history, and to insist that now, as then, Russia is facing this great existential threat, and that now, as then, the country must rally together behind a strong leader. So it's deeply, deeply cynical. And it is certainly not the case that everybody in these countries believes these official myths. But I came to think of them as almost like a tool of control, a way to dominate the official discourse, you know, to dominate what children are taught in schools, and to use that past, that period of history, as a way to try and cement the current regime's legitimacy.
So we'll get to North Korea in due time. And I really like the addition of this country to the other two, the big powers we spend so much time thinking about. But taking on Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin first, both are on the cover of your book, menacingly looking at me right now. I would argue you analyze how their immense power in their own countries hinges on World War II, of course, on the memory of that, and on remembering defeating, of course, Hitler's Germany on the one hand and Imperial Japan on the other hand, and shaping those stories, as you've just pointed out. And that still has staying power 8 decades on, which is quite a long time. The historian Timothy Snyder, who's been much in the news since the start of the war, of course, describes how this eternal recycling of heroic history works in Russia. But I was wondering, from your perspective, you've lived and reported from both countries, working on the ground, are there differences or similarities? Is one of them maybe more the case in how these leaders keep history alive, if you can say it like that?
Well, one of the things that struck me about both countries, and I was based in Moscow from the end of 2012 until the summer of 2015, and then I moved to China until midway through 2018, was that in both of these countries, if you look at the present day in terms of, you know, for instance, the enormous military parades through Red Square every May 9th and how present the war is now, it's easy to imagine that it has always been like that this has just been the case since 1945, that these wars have been a really key part of public commemoration, and that leaders have always commemorated them. But what is not the case, which is not the case. What really got me looking more deeply into the subject for the book was arriving in China in the summer of 2015 and covering what was actually the country's first ever Victory Day parade. In China, it's marked in September, the anniversary of the end of the war in Asia. And it was this extraordinary event, you know, very similar to the sort of thing I'd seen in Russia in terms of, you know, huge ICBM missile launchers driving through Tiananmen Square, enormous fly past, huge crowds, you know, a very moving and extraordinary event. But in fact, this was the first time this event had ever been held. It was one of 3 new commemorative days that had just been introduced into law the previous year. So it was really quite recent that the Communist Party was turning to the history of that war in its current form. And actually, as I was living in China, 2 years later, in 2017, Xi Jinping led efforts to formally lengthen the time frame of that war. So when I had first moved to China, the war, which is known there as the War of Resistance against Japan, was sort of formally seen to start in 1937 with this attack on the Marco Polo Bridge on the outskirts of Beijing, and to last until 1945. There was what was then treated as a separate regional conflict in the northeast in Manchuria from 1931 till 1937. But over the course of the time I was living there, the length of the war changed. So as of 2017, now the start of the regional war in Manchuria in 1931 was given as the start of the war, and what had previously been described as an 8-year war of resistance overnight became the 14-year war of resistance. So I felt that almost the history was changing, or at least the official approach to the history was changing in real time. And I wanted to understand why that was. Why was she taking such an interest in the history of this war? And similarly, in Putin's case, it's actually not the case that the war has always been commemorated that way in Russia. In fact, for 2 decades, from 1940, almost 2 decades, from 1947 to 1965, there was no Victory Day commemoration. Stalin cancelled the parade quite soon after it had started because he was worried about some of the great wartime generals potentially becoming a threat to his own popularity. So it was actually only during the Brezhnev era that commemoration of Victory Day was brought back. And then again, it had kind of died out during the latter stages of the Soviet Union. And it was really only the late 1990s and the early 2000s that it came back in its current very bombastic form. So I think it's important to understand that the version of these wars that is presented today in both of these countries is really quite recent, you know, in terms of a couple of decades in both cases. And actually for quite long periods, the regimes in power haven't really been very interested in looking at the history of that war because it didn't serve their purposes at the time. So for instance, as long as Mao Zedong was alive and was ruling China, he didn't want to acknowledge the role that the Kuomintang, the nationalist army led by Chiang Kai-shek, had played in the war, which, you know, if we're honest about it, was actually most of the fighting. It was the Kuomintang army that was really involved in most of the major battles against Japan. But because Chiang Kai-shek was then alive and on Taiwan, and Mao was concerned that he may be plotting an attack on the mainland, he didn't want to do anything that could give credit to Chiang Kai-shek or the KMT. For many decades, the KMT's part of that story was just written out of the narrative that was told on the mainland. And it was only really in the 1980s, under Deng Xiaoping, that the communists started to revisit that and to write the KMT back into the story of the war. So these sort of national narratives of the war, actually, to go back to your first question, are not static, they're not fixed, they're changing, and you see them kind of being reinterpreted from one regime to the next.
Of course, one reason why they're very good to have in an autocratic system, these parades and these commemorations, is because ideas of national greatness and external threat, of course, are pillar stones of autocratic rule. I think we've seen that demonstrated over the last few years in many countries. They create this logic of strong men needs to make this country great again, to quote from another country, and to keep us safe from the foreigners, of course, defend their people. Attached to specific wars, and you write about very specific wars, World War II and the Korean War, and attached to specific autocrats, the gentlemen on your book cover, of course, not that you don't write about their predecessors as well. When you put that together, it also becomes, I think, highly personal. So none of the rulers of the cover of your book were at all alive during the wars. They now commemorate every year with great effort, yet they have found ways to link themselves to their remembrance. Could you describe how that works and how that convinces people 8 decades on?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, and it is important just to caveat this that, you know, I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., and not long after I had moved here, Donald Trump was in power and he wanted his own military parade through Washington for the 4th of July, which those of us that study autocratic regimes, I think, were pretty roundly horrified by. I think that purpose it serves for each of these three men. And you're right to point out, they were not alive during these wars, and they also do not have much, and in certainly Putin and Xi's case, really any history of military service beyond, in Putin's case, I think, the obligatory service during his student days. But so these are men who are not, do not have a heroic backstory and a great pedigree of service during a war that they can draw from. So putting themselves front and center of this commemoration and being the guys who, in Putin and Xi's case, they have stood together multiple times during these parades at each other's commemorations. It gives them, or at least they are trying to draw from these wars and the genuine memory of those who did fight and die on behalf of the country. They are trying to channel that legacy and to present themselves now as the modern day defenders of these countries. And they, in all three cases, they really emphasize, and I think often we miss this from the outside, and certainly, it is propaganda that we shouldn't buy into, but the version of this story that they are telling their own people is that they are the ones defending the country, that it is their countries that are under attack. And the lesson that they're drawing from these past wars is yes, the great triumph, the sense of victory, but I think it's also more than that. It's more about the great suffering, the great vulnerability of the country in the past, how many people suffered, and much of that suffering is genuine, is true. It's about how the country suffered in the past when it was weak, when it was preyed upon, when it wasn't able to defend itself, and therefore know why in the present day they need strong leaders, they need to build up their military strength. They need to, in the case of North Korea, make sure they complete their nuclear arsenal, and they need to come together behind these three sort of modern day strongmen, but who in fact, as you're right to point out, have very little military experience of their own.
That cannot, I think you might have more of that experience yourself, because in a way, at least, because the book begins with a scene, of course, from your life reporting in Crimea, in part of the world that was becoming a war zone in 2014, as this covered up little green men invasion begins. And with that, Putin's ambition to literally change the map of Europe already became clearer, even though many people didn't really want to see that or acknowledge it. In his very long and tiring speeches, always very heavy on history, about his reasoning for his war and how his politics altogether, Putin not only draws on World War II, I would say, even though that's of course his main hobby horse, he also likes to compare himself to Tsar Peter the Great, of course, must have for a Russian leader. In the 17th century, he also drones on about the glories of the Kievan Rus in the 9th century, when Christianity took root in the region. That is a heady mix of history, I would say, to keep in mind as well as you write a book, I would imagine. So how did you approach judging these kinds of claims on a historic legacy? I mean, Russia is a very old country with lots of history. From a man who has often been described, and you did so yourself just now, as the ultimate cynic.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Putin's case, it's not to say that just because the stuff that he says is not true, and it's not, that he doesn't necessarily believe it. I think one of the most worrying things about Putin is the possibility that he does, in fact, truly believe all of the lies that he tells. In the book, as I approached researching and writing it, what I was really trying to do was understand what is the version of history that you would hear if you grew up in these countries, and how does the regime use that? So it was less to try and tease out, what is true, what is not, although I've made efforts through the book to say, particularly in the case of North Korea, for instance, this part is fictional. The entire origin story of Kim Il-sung, the current leader's grandfather, is pretty much mostly made up. There's a small nugget of truth in there, but the rest is really quite elaborate fantasy, and has grown over time, has become only more elaborate and less close to the truth as time has gone on. So it was less about what is objectively true and more what is the version of history that these leaders are selling, and how do they use that in the current day. So in Kim Jong-un's case, for instance, what is the link that he draws between that past experience during the Korean War, which the version that he tells to his citizens is that it was the United States and South Korea that attacked the North, when of course in real life it was the other way around. How does he relate that experience of suffering and fighting during that war to the present day push for nuclear weapons? Because he does draw a very direct link between these two. And in the case of Russia, I mean, this really started for me during those early days of 2014, when I was spending a lot of time in Ukraine. I was based in Moscow, but I was traveling backwards and forwards to Ukraine a lot, and hearing how early and how readily, particularly the people fighting on the separatist side in eastern Ukraine and the sort of what were kind of known as self-defense groups in Crimea, how easily and how often they brought up the Great Patriotic War, or the Second World War, and how they would immediately draw on that as the frame of reference for what was happening now. And I, at the time, and perhaps naively, thought, well, this period of history, this is how people are, this is being explained to people through state media and the education system, but this won't necessarily be persuasive. People won't be prepared to fight, to put their own lives on the line. People won't believe this. It's so clearly propaganda. And I didn't think, right up until the 24th of February 2022, pretty much, that Putin would go as far as he has in terms of trying to use that history to cloak his present day invasion. So I have to say that even having studied this for many years and spent a lot of time reporting on the ground, I hadn't fully understood the extent to which he was prepared to take this, and just how much that history would come into play in the current day war.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to believe it as well as a human being, I guess. You also go through this whole roller coaster of how these wars have been seen over the last decades in each country, and Russia is a very dramatic case. First, it was, of course, Stalin's personal victory, more or less. Then he got tired of it and worried for the future. People should concentrate on rebuilding the country, and the war commemorations were cancelled. Then there was this whole thaw period where Stalin fell out of favor himself. Brezhnev, of course, brought this cult of war to a new high, and Gorbachev, of course, tried to complicate the story with not much success in the end. And Putin has proven a master of reheating these Russian passions for remembering the dead. And it can feel very militaristic and very strange, especially for a German, to see these parades and to think about war that way. But of course, we started the war, and that's in your book several times. The estimated number of dead Soviet people right now is 27 million people. And I've put that number to a few of my colleagues today, and they were just staggered. And I mean, Germany cannot be accused to be a country where people don't think a lot about World War II, at least now. So I was wondering if you were thinking about things like trauma, national trauma, personal trauma, and also intergenerational trauma, because I would imagine that needs to play a role in keeping these stories alive and in such an emotional way. I mean, you talk about these new parades of people parading with pictures of their grandfathers, and Putin, of course, has manipulated that and made it his own.
Yeah, I think there's a really important difference to draw between personal commemoration and people who are trying to keep the stories of their own relatives, their own personal stories alive, and to hand that history down and to share that history with younger generations. And official commemoration and official approaches to the war. And the case that you mentioned of the parades of people who march with photos of their relatives is a really interesting example, and it's actually where the title of the book comes from, Dancing on Bones. This was something that one of the original founders of this movement, which is called the Immortal Regiment, this was his view that what had started as really a grassroots effort. It was him and a couple of friends who had gotten kind of disillusioned with the official commemorations of the war. As you say, they felt they were too bombastic and militaristic. They were all about celebrating, state power and glorious heroes and great victory. And they felt that in that was being lost the memory of the real people, the families who lost brothers and sons and husbands and whose relatives had died in the war. So their idea was to try and bring the real people back into the celebration and the commemoration of the war. So their idea was that on May 9th, instead of taking part in the sort of official parade, they would just walk quietly holding photographs of their relatives, and it would be called the Immortal Regiment. And they didn't expect it would be wildly successful, but it was. It took off, and within a couple of years, there were hundreds of thousands and then several million people taking part in these marches all across Russia, because it turned out there was a genuine and a real desire to mark the commemoration of the war in this way. But what had started as this grassroots movement about putting the real people back into the commemoration was very quickly co-opted by the authorities. They could not abide a grassroots nationwide movement that brought millions and millions of people together to exist outside of official control. So they set up their own, somebody close to the Kremlin set up a parallel movement called the Immortal Regiment of Russia, that then became the official Immortal Regiment and basically subsumed the earlier movement. So it still continues, and now it's there was an Immortal Regiment march in New York this year. There are marches in Sydney. There are marches in multiple countries around the world. I'm not sure that there is one in Germany, but I can certainly look into it. So the state, I think you see in that, and when the state had taken over the Immortal Regiment and turned it into, then it had become really everything that the founders didn't want it to be. So it was then again becoming kind of bombastic. Putin started marching in it, so you'll see him often at the front of the Immortal Regiment in Moscow holding a picture of his own father. And people, there were reports that school children were being forced to take part, given photographs of people they had no idea who were on it. It would be sponsored by a local bank, and then at the end, people were dumping the photos in the trash bin. So it was really everything that they didn't want this movement to be. And his phrase, his sort of exasperated appeal was, this is dancing on bones. He was saying, just stop, just please stop. Like, you all have families, you all have people who fought. This is just dancing on bones. So that was what I used for the title of the book, because for me it captured this sense that there is the real and true and rightfully commemorated memory of people who fought, and then there is how the authorities marshal that memory and use those commemorations for their own end. So I felt there was really this quite important difference between personal approaches to the war, which in Russia and China, even at times when those in power weren't particularly interested in having these grand commemorations, and in some cases when memory of the war was kind of being suppressed, there would still be small-scale marches of veterans. People would still get together on anniversaries to talk about the war. So there has been a sort of consistent grassroots strand of commemoration in Russia and China since 1945. But it's really at points where it's become politically useful, as in the current case, that those in power have really seized on it and have really turned up the volume and amplified these commemorations into the kind of thing that we see in the present day.
Before I move on a little bit, I want to encourage the audience for the very end to already put a few questions in the chat. If we don't talk about something you would want to know Katie's opinion on or expertise on, I will pose a few in the very end. And of course, if you type them out now, we will see them. There's already lots of comments, but questions are, of course, also important. So what's behind all three, I would think, of these national stories that you tell and wrangle maybe, is, I think, a kind of loss of certainty of ideology that marks the 20th century in a way. All three, of course, are communist systems right after World War II. It's very visible in the aesthetic as well. But they become something a little different under the influence of nationalism. That's a big theme in the book, and historical propaganda that's tied to that. China becomes a kind of hyper-capitalist surveillance state with a rebooted cult of personality under Xi Jinping. Russia becomes a kind of right-wing gangster state with funhouse mirror ethics, I would say. And North Korea becomes a very bizarre kind of Stalinist monarchy, maybe, cut loose from the rest of the world. So did you think about, when you wrote this book, what all three could morph into? I mean, there's still almost 80 years left in this century. Or do you think the cycles of 20th century history repeating itself that we talked about in the beginning will just roll on unendingly?
I think in terms of the search for ideology, you're right to draw that out as a feature, because I think in the Russian case, you see that really explicitly after the end of the Soviet Union and under the Yeltsin presidency. He has a formal competition to try to come up with a new national idea for Russia. There is this, a committee is formed to come up with ideas. There's a nationwide write-in essay contest, come up with a new national idea for Russia. What do we stand for now? And he was a little bit wary of the memory of the war, and he did preside over at least one victory parade. But for him, the concern was that the Communist Party might be trying to come back. So he, a little bit, like in the Chinese case, he was concerned that by dwelling too much on the memory of the Great Patriotic War, the Communist Party in the present day really stood to gain from that, because that would be this memory of how Russia or the Soviet Union under communist rule had achieved this great victory. So he's trying to come up with a new national idea for Russia, and in the context of the terrible humiliation that the country was suffering, the queues, the shortages, the chaos, the plummeting life expectancy, the huge rise in crime. It was a really difficult situation in the 1990s. So he was looking for something that could be a kind of glue, and he didn't find anything. At the end of this contest, he disbanded the committee, and there were newspaper headlines saying something like "Post-Soviet Russia plumbs its soul for new idea in vain." So he had tried and failed to come up with a new national idea. And I think the difference is Putin fairly early on, in fact, 2 days after his inauguration as president in May 2000, he presides over his first Victory Day parade. I think you see him seize quite early on this idea that Russia was and will be a great power. When you talk about the longer history that he's drawing on, that's very much part of that. This is Russia as a civilizational state that has earned its place as one of the world's great powers, and which must always be a great power, but which is currently faced with terrible difficulties. And over the course of his time in power, you see him quite recently, I think it's in the late 2010s, that he's asked about what is Russia's national idea. And he says patriotism. Patriotism is Russia's idea. There can be no other. Because he is also, if you look at the sort of plumbing of the soul in vain that Yeltsin had led, it's really difficult to find something that is a genuine triumph that the country can get behind and celebrate. There really isn't much. It's striking that he, on the centenary of the Bolshevik Revolution, for instance, really said almost nothing. He's not keen to focus on how a mass proletariat power overthrew a corrupt elite. That's not something he wants to focus on in the current day. The memory of the Bolshevik Revolution is really complex for him. There's the space race, but ultimately Soviet Union loses it. And there's the war. So particularly if you don't want to focus on all of the terrible things that happened under communist rule, then the war is really this one clear bright spot that also does command genuine emotion. This is not something that is necessarily being forced down people's throats. It was, the figures are staggering. This was a conflict that genuinely affected, every family has some connection to the war. So it resonates in a true way across the country, but it's also one of the only really great victories, because then, as you say, beyond that, then you're drawing on, Peter the Great and much further back in history. So I think there was a kind of paucity of ideas, which makes the war even more important to protect the memory and even more palatable and more useful in the current day.
This is also, I think, that has become clear in what you've just said, a very serious business, even though sometimes it seems a strange business as well, maybe from a Western perspective, even though we do it too, as you've already pointed out. But it's very striking when you talk about the Chinese Communist Party, who of course is involved in the serious business as well, when you point out how serious they take this historical memory in this giant country, especially since 2013, of course, that's in the book as well, when the battle against what they call historical nihilism starts. And you write about them promoting the idea of a century of humiliation. The word humiliation has been used sometimes already in our conversation, which is, I think, telling. And that describes this catastrophic downturn from thousands of years of glory from which only the CCP, so the Communist Party, could have saved China. So it's weighing the middle finger to the people, don't get rid of us, or you'll be back at the century of humiliation. And how serious this is, I think, is very clear in the scene you described. You meet a historian who is working against all of this fake history and myth making, and right at the next table, there is someone in a not very subtle way monitoring the situation, who is affiliated with the state. So I was wondering, after reading about that scene and your encounter with this person, I hope he's still safe, by the way, how effective a shield, this cloak of historical inevitability, what a word, is for the CCP against hyper-modern challenges, because China's in the news every day. There's stuff like supply chain breakdowns, there's pandemic management, there's technology and how they try to control that. On today's New York Times front page, they're talking about birth rates, and it's a very central story today. So I was wondering how you judge the effectiveness of controlling history in this ever faster world.
I think I see it as almost the greater challenges that China faces and the greater the threats that Xi Jinping perceives, the more he sees the need to keep a very tight grip of these historical narratives and to put a lot of effort into what China calls ideological work. I think you can trace this back when you look at the Communist Party's response to Tiananmen. So 5 days after the massacre in Tiananmen Square in June 1989, Deng Xiaoping gives this address to some of the military officers who've been involved in the crackdown and tells them that our biggest mistake has been in ideological education. We didn't do enough to tell people about the old days and what kind of country China was to become. And you see after that, this really nationwide effort, what's known as the Patriotic Education Campaign, that comes in the early to mid 1990s, which is really about enforcing or drumming into people, and the directives for the campaign is that this should be for the whole of society, from kindergarten through to pensioners. Everybody needs to understand this important piece of history, and that historical lesson is how China suffered in the past. the sort of unofficial slogan of the campaign is never forget national humiliation. And the message is really this very straightforward moral of, before the Communist Party came to power, China was carved up and torn apart by these predatory foreign powers. The country suffered terribly. And it was only once the Communist Party came to power and was able to rally the people together to repel the Japanese invasion and then found the People's Republic that China was able to rise to its current state. They talk about New China as being founded in 1949. And I think you see a little bit of, when she comes to power, when he becomes the leader of the party in late 2012, this sense, as Deng had in 1989, that they've kind of taken the situation for granted, that the economy has been going through its miraculous growth phase. It's the years of double-digit GDP growth, and that the Communist Party has kind of let ideological work slip. Like, there are still periodic patriotic education campaigns, but it's sort of rote. Membership of the Communist Party is becoming more something that you do for career advancement and to secure a decent salary and good prospects for your life, rather than because people really believe in it. And I think she wants to really take a tight grip of the situation. He is not taking anything for granted. I think you could argue he's governed from sort of day one as though the Communist Party is in this real existential peril. So they've got to take a tight grip of ideological education once again. And these 7 dangers that are identified in the spring of 2013 include what you described as historical nihilism, or attempts to challenge the party's version of the past. So he oversees this really concerted crackdown then on keeping history under a tight grip. And I think that one of the challenges he faces now is with a generation that has really only ever known a rising China, that has really only ever known an economy that gets better from year to year, and where you can expect your children's lives to be better than your own. And as that becomes less assured, and the Communist Party can less easily point to its economic performance as a source of legitimacy, I think we will see more and more, as we've already seen, this turn to nationalism and the idea that any problems with the country are not the current leadership's fault. It's all because of something that outside powers are doing to China, rather than because the current leadership could ever possibly make a mistake.
Yeah, of course not. Coming from the national level again to the human level, maybe you talk in the book also about Chinese people who you've met, whose families have, so the past families, the families that lived through the wars, have been celebrated at one time as war heroes and martyrs, and at other times, when the political winds shift, as traitors to the nation and the cause, depending on what politics are on the forefront. And their status in the past has very real consequences, of course, for the people living in their families right now, also for the future as well. So their whole life can be shaped by that. And that made me think about a great podcast I've listened to this year by the Financial Times, The Prince, about Xi Jinping. I'm sure you've heard about that or listened to it yourself, which tackles Xi Jinping's own complicated family history. I think we don't know much about him in the West, even though he is arguably the most powerful person in the world. And his brushes with these dangerous dynamics of what my family did in the past might determine my whole future. So he has been in a very dangerous situation before. So how do you explain this, him becoming the chief enforcer of dynamics like that?
I think when you talked earlier about this idea that has history ended or not, I think one of the important things for me is to understand just how differently certain people have understood that history and the different lessons that they have drawn from it. And I think when we look at the outside from what we know of Xi Jinping's personal story, and particularly his experience during the Cultural Revolution, which we do know a little bit about. This was the campaign from 1966 to 1976, when he was, I think, 13 at the start of the Cultural Revolution. This was sort of Mao's he dressed it up as an attempt to save the party and save China from saboteurs who were trying to establish a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. But really, it was about him getting back control of the Communist Party, enforcing ideological purity, and kind of jump-starting his ideas. Xi Jinping suffered very badly during that. We know that he was bullied and was chased by Red Guards, these sort of young teenage enforcers, through Beijing. His father, who had been a senior official but who'd fallen out of favor and been purged, was beaten. He was detained for a long period. Xi Jinping's mother is said to have denounced him at one of these public struggle sessions. His older half-sister is thought to have killed herself. And then he was among the millions of young people who were sent down to the countryside in 1968. The idea, I think even Mao had understood the situation was getting out of control, and the idea was to send all the young people then to the countryside to get a grip of the situation, and they were supposed to learn these communist ideals by working in the fields and learning from the peasants. So he was one of those people, and you might expect, and the podcast series you mentioned is excellent. I would highly recommend the Prince to anyone looking to understand Xi Jinping. The lesson you might expect him to draw from that is that this is what happens under one-man rule, that this is a campaign that was born really of Mao's paranoia, the extent to which he consolidated power in his own hands, and the lesson that a lot of other people in China took from that period was this must never be allowed to happen again. Never again must one man be allowed to hold so much power. But that is not the lesson that Xi Jinping seems to have taken from it. In fact, he seems to think that the answer is more power centrally controlled. The lesson he seems to have taken from it is that what is dangerous is when the masses get involved. That what got out of hand here was the sort of, the unrest across cities, the student enforcers who were sort of taking the law into their own hands, that actually the answer to the problem is more control, more power in the center, and a stricter grip on ideology. And it doesn't seem to have caused him, or in fact his father, Xi Jong-sun, to question the Communist Party at all. It's more the mechanism of control that they question, rather than the Communist Party's approach to leadership. So I think we sort of at our peril assume that people are learning one lesson from these situations. But I think that has, Xi Jinping has personal lived experience of what it can feel like to lose power, of suddenly being totally powerless and unable to help yourself. So, at the risk of psychoanalyzing him, you can see how that might lead to a desire to make sure that you hold on to power at all costs, and you never allow yourself to become vulnerable, or you put yourself in the hands of the masses again.
Yeah, that sounds very plausible. So for the home stretch, I of course want to talk about North Korea for a bit, and then pose one or two questions from the audience. People also have to read the book for more on North Korea. But the inclusion in your narrative, I think, makes it even more compelling, I thought. We, of course, read a lot about Russia and China, not only in newspapers and magazines, but the books are everywhere. But it gives this book such an interesting case of compare and contrast, I think, to the other two, because it works on so many levels in a way. North Korea is not a superpower in the way we think about Russia and China, maybe Russia again or not even, that depends on your perspective. A regional power, Obama said, to his peril, maybe. It is mostly walled off from the world, most of the world. Nuclear threats not counted here. It's so enigmatic, it's strange and frightening to many people, what we can see from there, if at all. Yet there's also this kind of cartoonish, even camp element to how it's perceived by us in the West. So you write about the toy tanks and toy rockets in the kindergartens where the kids ride on, where we have like wooden animals, they have toy tanks. There's the histrionic news readers that go viral on Twitter whenever they have an announcement to make. There's this bizarre cult around the Kim family who lead a communist state, but are basically godlike monarchs, handing power to each other, one generation after the other. And there's a captivating passage in the book about witnessing a parade in Pyongyang. You were there in 2016, I think, trying to decide who's really earnest and sincere in front of the leader, looking down from his palace balcony, and who's faking it for the sake of ritual. And I think most of us will have the television pictures from when his father died still in mind, with this excessive crying in the streets. So how did you yourself, switching maybe the perspective, operate in this radically different society? Did you feel yourself changing as a visitor when you were there?
I mean, I think one thing I was very aware of when I was there was just the very high stakes for everyone that we were speaking to. Yeah. So it was a very sort of parallel reality. I mean, I was based in China, so I was used to working under a very controlled situation, but this was an altogether different level. And I was just very conscious with everyone I was speaking to. So for instance, so everywhere you went, you had these two government officials who described themselves as guides, but who a lot of people call minders, because you couldn't go anywhere without them. There were always two of them, the rationale being that so then they were also watching each other and making sure that one of them wasn't getting too close to us, telling us things we shouldn't know, or taking us places that we weren't allowed. And one morning, one of these gentlemen had said to me, how would you like to go and see how an ordinary North Korean citizen lives? Would you like that? And myself and my the camera operator said, yes, that would be great. Please take us. So they brought us to one of the brand new apartment blocks that you see in central Pyongyang on what's known as Scientists Street. So these are kind of prestigious new build high-rise apartments that the regime sort of presents as proof of how Kim Jong-un is bringing prosperity to North Korea. When we got there, we found probably 20, 30 pairs of shoes already on the doormat outside, because it was apparent that this one woman who was described to us as a school teacher had been selected to be the real ordinary North Korean citizen for roughly the 100 camera crews that were visiting for this event. So we were all sort of trooping in and out of her apartment, and she was showing us around and making sure to say how grateful she was to the Kim family, and how everything that she had was because of them, and they owe everything to them. And she would sort of turn and gesture up the portraits of the founding leader Kim Il-sung and his son Kim Jong-il on the wall, and her eyes would sort of brim with tears. And so I would be talking to her, just a couple of feet away in her own home, and she's talking in really moving terms about how much she adores these men and how much she and her family owes to them. And I remember just thinking, I just have no way to know what you actually think right now. I think it would be really naive to assume that everything you're telling me, which is being filmed by a Western TV crew, and the two guys are right with me and they're writing down everything you say. How could I possibly know what she thinks? And I sort of took that writ large to then these, the mass parades that you see, which I think there can be a tendency from the outside, and actually in all three countries to some extent, to kind of dehumanize real people living in these countries, and to sort of present North Korea as this, like you say, it's almost like caricature sometimes in the news of sort of, goose-stepping, totally brainwashed people who are absolutely loyal to the regime. But the reality is we can't possibly know what people think, and we shouldn't interpret the behavior that people are sort of required to perform in public as indicative of how they really feel. And then, in fact, how I came to think about it, and it tied into how I thought about the broader war story too, was it was less that this was an exercise in creating true believers. Certainly in all three cases, if they can achieve that, those in power absolutely want to do that. That's certainly one of the aims of the education from early childhood on, is cultivating, loyalty, faith, love, and good feelings towards the regime. But for everyone else, it's more about a tool of control. And that when you, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who has an excellent book, Strongman, that looks at Mussolini in particular, has written really well about this. Almost the more bizarre the public spectacle you require people to take part in. So like the funeral, having everybody crying and wailing and prostrating in the street, for some people, that's genuine. For everyone else, that's a message that says, this is how you are required to act. And because the regime can require you to act that way, therefore, it's powerful. I write in the book about the example then of Nicolae Ceausescu in the closing days of his regime in Romania, and how, having previously been to any number of these great big mass celebrations where, like Kim Jong-un, the crowd was cheering and chanting the slogans and people were supposedly overcome with emotion that he was right there, that actually once he was challenged in public and once he was heckled, and once people understood that actually other people also felt that same way, that could catch on very quickly. So I think these mass events, certainly for some proportion of people who were there, and you would see, grown adults absolutely wailing. I saw a man who could barely walk. He was screaming at the top of his lungs. You would see people with tears streaming down their faces. For some people, they surely feel that way, but for everyone else, that experience is a lesson in this is how you have to behave. And it was really striking to me watching that as soon as it ended. So when beforehand, everybody was sort of standing around completely silently. They were all in their places, lined up across the square. As soon as the band started up and Kim Jong-un walked out onto the balcony, everybody went from totally blank faces and, maybe just nervous or bored, and people had been, people were walking across the city from sort of 5 a.m. to take part in this. So presumably also tired and fed up. They would go from totally blank faces to absolute screaming hysteria. And then when it was over, when Kim Jong-un walked back into the building and the band died down, people just turned and walked away as one. And it wasn't, sometimes I think after a big event, you have this sort of sense of like a hubbub of people kind of talking to each other and sharing experiences and a genuine sense of excitement. This was the opposite of that. Everybody turned, and I remember thinking it was like watching a tide going out. People just walked away, and myself and the cameraman were sort of having to run after them because we were trying to, we wanted to speak to a couple of people and get some sorts of interviews about, who they were and what they were doing there. And so there wasn't this sort of sense that we just took part in something life-changing and extraordinary, and we saw the leader right there. Of course, that's what people would say if you stopped them and asked them. But there didn't seem to be a great deal of, real, genuine depth of emotion about what had just happened. So, perhaps that's because people weren't comfortable showing their emotions in public. But again, I think the lesson to take from it is that we just shouldn't assume that even though people are required to repeat all of these slogans and to act in a certain way, that doesn't mean that they're not perfectly capable, as people in past totalitarian regimes have been, in privately holding very, very different opinions on their own.
Maybe one last question before I'll pose one or two from the audience. I've got many more, I'm sorry to say, but we'll have to keep a check on time. We haven't talked that much about threats and enemies. Of course, I've mentioned them. Every one of those countries has its designated eternal enemy in a way. Hitler's Germany, of course, Imperial Japan for China. And for North Korea, the eternal bogeyman is, of course, the United States, because in their historical retelling, they, of course, took part in the Korean War and were so bad in it, basically behaved so bad in it, that now there is a North Korean museum for American war atrocities that you write about. That sounds pretty terrifying, like a kind of horror show Madame Tussauds, with lots of demonstrations of Americans raping and killing people in horrible ways. You just give a few examples. It's still very, it's still stuck in my mind. So, of course, I went back to the pictures and videos we saw a few years ago when President Trump was the first one to visit North Korea, actually. Quite a decision, I say, diplomatically. And of course, he came with the intention of making history and showing people at home what he was capable of pulling off. But how would this historic visit, however you would rate what came of it, would have looked to an average peasant in North Korea who is used to having to go into this museum? And what would he make of this strange American?
Yeah, I actually thought it was I was very interested to see how those interactions would be portrayed in North Korea, because you're right, America has been the ultimate bogeyman since 1950, and the museum that you describe, the Sinchon Museum of American War Atrocities, it's important to say there's no evidence that American soldiers actually carried out any of the acts that they're accused of in that museum. There is some evidence that certainly a massacre took place on that site, but historians who've looked at it quite closely think the best evidence is that it was inter-Korean violence rather than anything American soldiers who were not in the area at the time could possibly have done. But nevertheless, that is the version of events that is told to North Korean people. And you see it, I mean, in classrooms. So I visited a kindergarten where you're right, there were sort of, tanks and small fighter aircraft in the playground for the children. And I visited an elementary school where when you walk down the corridor between classroom, you would see these big pictures, which I recognized from the Sinchon museum. So these are very, very young children are walking past very graphic images of, other children being buried alive, people being impaled, people being tortured in horrible ways by these very sort of caricature, sort of hook-nosed American GIs. So it's Americans and it's Japanese who are really vilified in the North Korean propaganda. And all the way through that sort of diplomatic charm offensive that we saw with Trump and Kim and all the talk of the great love letters and all the rest of it, people who were visiting North Korea, so some of the more prominent anti-American propaganda, for instance, in Pyongyang, was being taken down. It was less obvious, but that was in the parts of the country that more diplomats could easily see and foreign media tours were seeing. But actually through that time, Sinchon Museum of American War Atrocities was still operating. The coach loads of people were still turning up there every day. So even while Kim was sort of experimenting with outreach to Trump, he was still trying to instill this sense within the education system and through these public visits to museums that Americans are this great irreconcilable enemy. And the spin that they put on it in North Korea was to use very selective images of
Also, ja, das verstehe ich nicht.
You would have to mute yourself again. Not Katie, but from the audience.
So just there were very selective images used of the interactions between Kim and Trump that would show Trump sort of, looking down or looking contrite or listening as Kim was speaking. So it showed sort of Kim very much being the one who was in control, in power, and it was presented as, because the country is now so powerful, it has been able to force America to sit down with the leader and to talk to them as equals. So it's presented as sort of, this is evidence of how powerful the country has become under the Kim's leadership, that this is where it is now. Just final point on this, which I think speaks to this divide between whether people actually believe it and not, is that then American colleagues who visited North Korea would find that actually in their interactions with ordinary citizens, people didn't spit at them and swear at them and hold them responsible for things during the Korean War. There seemed to be somewhat of a disconnect between this sort of the idea of this enemy America, which I guess was somewhat the case too during the Cold War and the Soviets' idea of having, you know, separate Americas, the sort of ruling class being responsible for all of the bad things, and then ordinary Americans being themselves somewhat a victim of the system. But it certainly doesn't necessarily seem to connect into, you know, real antipathy towards actual Americans that people had met.
Well, thank you. I have picked Waltraud Peter's question, if I may pose it to you, and it goes back to where we started off. What is the mutual interest of Putin and Kirill, the Patriarch of Moscow, in collaborating and supporting the war in Ukraine? So religion is something we didn't talk about a lot.
Yeah, religion, and I towards the end of the book write about Putin and Kirill going to open this new church of the armed forces on the outskirts of Moscow, which is this enormous Orthodox cathedral in sort of khaki green, and which inside has sort of battle scenes and tributes to people who fought in the Georgian War, people who are involved in what's described as the return of Crimea in Russia. And I came to think about that as Putin has really quite closely associated himself with Kirill and the Orthodox Church. I think, I mean, who knows what his own personal religious beliefs are, but it really plays to this idea of a great Russia, of Russia's sort of unique features as a civilization. He plays greatly on the idea that he's defending conservative values, and his association with the Orthodox Church really goes hand in hand with that. So like, while I was there, for instance, was when he brought out this, the law against, I forget exactly the terminology, it was awful. It was like the promotion of homosexual values. And it basically meant that people, if you did anything that can be described as propagandizing a homosexual relationship in front of a minor, then you could be prosecuted. And because it was so vague, it was unclear, what did that mean? You know, I had gay friends in Moscow at the time who were asking, you know, if I walk down the street holding hands with my partner, am I propagandizing a same-sex relationship? Could I be subject to this? He really picked on, he really targeted same-sex relationships, which Putin has often elided and talked about. For instance, around the Sochi Olympics, he was asked how he could guarantee that people's rights would be respected. And he said something to the effect of, gay people are welcome to come, we just ask them to stay away from the children. He has continually elided the idea of homosexuality with the idea of pedophilia. And I think it's really about presenting himself and presenting his Russia as standing in opposition to what he presents as sort of liberal culture in the West. So I think the association with the Orthodox Church both draws on this, you know, centuries-long history of a great, powerful Tsarist Russia, and on the present day as the sort of defender of conservative values, which there certainly is an audience for here in the US too. Despite everything that's happening, there are certain groups here that are big fans of Putin for that reason.
I mean, you can say the same for Germany as well. So maybe to close off with, but a very interesting and big question that ties it all together, I would be interested to hear how you see the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in relation to that between China and Taiwan, what makes them similar, what makes them different, and potentially how these two situations might influence each other going forward. That's a big one.
It is a big one. I mean, I think certainly in terms of how they are presented, they both go to this sort of grand historical narrative that both Putin and Xi are trying to instill in their own populations. So with Putin, the story he tells about Ukraine is of being sort of historically part of Russia and being this being, I guess, the local or the proximate battlefield with the West, that this is where Russia is making its stand against the West and defending its own national security. Obviously, that's not the case, but that's the version that he is selling. With China's narrative on Taiwan, that really ties into this idea of what she talks about as national rejuvenation. So the first thing he does when he becomes the leader of the party is to take all of the top officials, the standing committee, to an exhibition on the national rejuvenation of China. And it's really about finally undoing this history of national humiliation. So it's finally getting back all of the territory that China believes was lost at the hands of foreign powers and was taken from China when it was weak. I think the similarity between the two is she is making the case that China can never be whole. It can never have fully overcome that past humiliation, and it can never have reached its true and rightful status as a great power if it doesn't recover all of its historical territories and become whole again. So he certainly presents that internally as this, this is something that rightfully belongs to China, that is being taken from China by nefarious foreign powers, and which the Chinese people must get back. The difference, and maybe one slightly optimistic and hopeful note to close on, is that he's been very careful not to set a time limit on that. So there's a lot of talk at the moment about timelines and could it be 2025, could it be 2027? If you look at what Xi Jinping has actually said, he has said in very vague terms that this is not a problem that can simply be handed down from generation to generation. And he has set one of the 2 millennium goals for 2049, the anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, that China should have achieved its national rejuvenation. So if it had fully achieved national rejuvenation by that point, that would mean it had reclaimed Taiwan. But he's been very careful not to set himself a hard limit on it. And I think one of the things that may have been learned from one conflict with a bearing on the other is how difficult such an operation would be. An invasion of, we have seen how the Russian army has really floundered and really performed absolutely disastrously in Ukraine, not to take away at all from Ukraine's very brave fight. But seeing how much Russia has struggled in what is an operation right on Russia's border, within land reach of Russia, mounting an invasion on Taiwan across 100 miles of water, using a military that has not fought any wars for many decades now, would be a very significant undertaking and would really jeopardize everything else that the Communist Party tells Chinese people that it stands for. So, the idea that your future is going to be, your children's future will be more assured than your own, that China is rising to great power status, that the Communist Party is ensuring a better future for all of its citizens, that would all be jeopardized by an attack on Taiwan. So I think, hopefully, one of the lessons that has been learned is that this is not an operation to undertake lightly, and that Taiwan's partners and friends are doing what they can to rush weapons and defenses there as quickly as they can to try and also push the balance in Taiwan's favor, and to really just double down on what an undertaking this would be. So I hope that one of the lessons that has been taken within the region is the importance of defense, deterrence, and in Taiwan's case, what's been described as the porcupine strategy of making yourself so dangerous, so difficult to digest that the cost of an offensive would be too high to be undertaken. But I think the other important thing to take from this is that what we, looking at the outside, might seem, Putin's invasion never made logistical sense. It was always clear that he wouldn't be able to subdue a country of 40 million people with 200,000 troops, that in so doing he would devastate Russia's economy and ruin the lives of millions of his own citizens. It doesn't make logical sense, but I think we also can't underestimate the dangers when power is concentrated in one person's hands, when the people who report to that person are incentivized to tell them good news and to tell them that they're brilliant and wise and that their operation will certainly succeed. So, logic argues very strongly against any attempt on Taiwan, but the one thing to always bear in mind is that's why these autocratic systems can be vulnerable, is because ultimately it does come down to one man's judgment operating in often a very limited information environment.
Yes, and I think that's a very good point to end on, especially because that's a lesson I would say that Germany has learned the hard way, and we've just commemorated Holocaust Memorial Day, of course, so we know where that can lead. On that cheerful note, I want to thank Katie Stallard very much. It's been a brilliant opportunity to hear you talk about the book. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, I think. I see people clapping in the audience. I want to thank them as well for participating tonight, coming to this, even though you could sit on your sofas for once. I also want to tell you that we are having a week of exceptional journalists, because on Thursday, we are going to talk to Susan Glasser of The New Yorker about The Divider, her Trump book. So tune in for that. That's on YouTube. The live stream is on our homepage. Und wenn Sie sich mit 5 € beteiligen möchten an dem Unkostenbeitrag, finden Sie die Details in der E-Mail, mit der Sie sich eingeloggt haben, damit wir auch das Online-Programm am Laufen halten können. And with that, thank you and good night, everybody. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, guests. Goodbye.
Thank you.